Good morning. I hope you all are doing well today. It's so nice to see you all. Today we are going to pick up our story from where we left off last week with Miss Lori. And we're going to be talking about the crucifixion of Jesus. So last week we finished with Jesus being taken up the hill or to Golgotha. And Golgotha was a hill outside of the city, and this means the place of the skull. And as they walked up there, there was a big crowd because there were lots of people, and they were all still screaming and telling Jesus, you know, that he was not a good person. Crucify him, take him, kill him. And when they got up there, the soldiers, they offered Jesus some wine that was mixed with gall. Gall is just like, well, actually, some people say it grows on the side of a tree. It just makes everything very bitter. And after tasting it, Jesus wouldn't drink it. And so they then nailed him to the cross, and they nailed him in his hands and in his feet. And they placed, he had the crown of thorn on his head, and then they placed a sign above him. And as they were putting him up on the cross and hanging him there, the soldiers gathered his clothing. And Jesus spoke out and he said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they're doing." It's just incredible to think that Jesus had been mocked and cursed and beaten, and he still is asking God to forgive them. But Jesus knew that there was a bigger plan, and that he had to do these things to make it so that you and I could go to heaven and to be together with him for eternity. And he knew that this little tiny amount of pain and suffering would be worth a lifetime and eternity of happiness for you and I. And so the soldiers, they took the clothing that they had taken off of Jesus and they divided it among themselves. And there were 4 of them. So there were 4 shares. And actually, this is a prophecy that we find in the Bible. The Bible tells us in the Old Testament that this is going to happen. And it also tells us that there was one piece of clothing, Jesus's tunic, that was woven from the top to the bottom. So there were no seams in it. And that because it was so perfect, the soldiers didn't want to destroy it, like cut it in 4s, one for each of them. And so they decided that because it was so perfect that they were going to cast lots, and each of them would try to win the piece. So casting lots was like throwing dice, or it was a way of gambling back then. So they threw the dice, and one of the soldiers received that piece of clothing whole. So it was 9 o'clock in the morning when Jesus was crucified, and he was hung in between 2 other soldiers. And there was one on his left, or not soldiers, I'm sorry, criminals. And there was one on his left and one on his right. And the sign that Pilate had decided to put above Jesus's head, it read, "Jesus the Nazarene, the King of the Jews." Well, as you can guess, this made the Jewish leaders very unhappy, because they didn't want anything to do with Jesus. They're the whole reason that Jesus was up on this cross. They wanted him to be crucified because he was saying all of these things that they didn't believe were true. And Pilate also made sure that this notice was written in Aramaic and Latin and Greek so that everyone could read it. Like, it wasn't just the Jewish people or the people of that city that could read it. It was everyone. It was written in all of the languages. So the chief priests, they went to Pilate and they said, "Do not write this, the King of the Jews, but rather, this man said, 'I am the King of the Jews.'" Well, Pilate said, "I have written what I have written." And once again, we see that the Jewish people were rejecting the one that they needed. They, again, had rejected God when they were in Egypt. He kept telling them, like, you don't need a king. And they said, we want a king. And so then he gave them Saul. And Jesus himself was actually proclaimed to be the king of the Jews by the wise men when he was first born. But Jesus knew that he was not the king of this world. He was not the king of the Jews. He was the king of an earthly kingdom, or a heavenly kingdom, not an earthly kingdom. And that, again, his plan, that God's plan had to be fulfilled. So as Jesus is hanging on this cross, he's still being defamed, and people are yelling at him and saying, you who destroyed the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, why don't you save yourself? Come off that cross. And they would say things that, why don't you save yourself, that we might see and believe? And they just continued to mock him and curse him the whole time that he was up there. Well, even the people that were hanging on the crosses next to him, criminals who deserved to be there, started to mock him and curse him. And one of the criminals said, are you the Christ? Why don't you save yourself and save us? Well, one of the other criminals, the criminal on his other side, said, do you not fear God? You are under the same sentence of condemnation, for we are getting what we deserved for what we did. But this man who is between us, he has done nothing wrong. So then the soldier, he looked at Jesus and he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus said to him, I will tell you the truth. Today you will be with me in paradise. Just the heart and the soul of Jesus is so incredible, to think that as he's suffering on this cross next to two people who deserved it, and yet even they are mocking him, but yet he still has compassion for them as well. And standing beside him at the cross was his mom and John, his disciple, and as well as his mother's sister, Mary, and Mary Magdalene. And when Jesus saw that his mother was there with John, he said to his mother, he said, look, here is your son. And he was really wanting Mary to realize that he wanted John to be her son. And then he looked at John and he said, look, here is your mother. And John knew that he needed to care for Jesus's mom for the rest of her life, that he needed to take over that place for Jesus. And he did. He took her into his own home and cared for her. After this, Jesus realized by this time that everything was complete. And so he said, again, to fulfill scripture and prophecy, he said, I am thirsty. And there was a jar of sour wine that was there. It was something that the soldiers tended to drink. It was their favorite drink. So it was always around. And so they took a sponge and they filled it with that wine, and they stuck it on the end of a stick, a branch of hyssop. And they lifted it up to his mouth so that he could take a drink. Well, when it was noon, remember we started at 9 a.m. and now it's noon, there became this darkness over all the earth. And it was really, really dark. It was like, you guys remember when we had our solar eclipse and how dark it got? Well, it was even darker than that. Like there was just no sun. And that lasted until 3 o'clock. So for 3 hours, the whole land was covered in darkness. And at around 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, and he said, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? He knew at this time that God had to be apart from him because he had to take on all of the sin of the world. And God could not be by sin. He could be near sin. And Jesus had to leave God. This is the thing he dreaded more than anything, was to be away from God. When some of the bystanders heard this, they said, listen, he's calling for Elijah. And then Jesus called out in a loud voice and he says, into your hands I commit my spirit. And at that very moment, he breathed his last breath. And in the temple, not like in the city, far away, all of a sudden, the curtain, it tore from the top clear to the bottom. And I mean, that is crazy because if you remember how big that curtain is to get to the top, to tear it to the bottom, I mean, that was spectacular. And not only that, but the whole earth shook and rocks were split apart and tombs were opened and the bodies of many of the saints that had died were raised. And they came out of their tombs after Jesus had been resurrected, and they went into the city and appeared to people like, how can you not believe that this man is the Son of God? There are dead people walking among you and they're coming to see you. Now, when the centurion who stood in front of Jesus saw him and how he had died, he said, truly, truly, this is the Son of God. Then, because it was the day of preparation, which means it was a Friday, because they were going to prepare for the Sabbath that was on Saturday. Remember, because the Sabbath day was still on Saturday back then, and they did no work on Saturday. So the day of preparation was on Friday. They knew that the bodies had to be taken down and that they could not stay on the crosses because they didn't want to be working on Saturday. And so the Jewish leaders asked Pilate to have the victims' legs broken and their bodies taken down. So they did this. They broke their legs so that they could no longer lift their bodies up to take a breath. So essentially they ended up suffocating. Well, when the soldiers went around, first they broke the legs of the two men that had been next to Jesus. And when they came to Jesus, they realized that he was already dead. So they did not break his legs. And this fulfills another prophecy that no bones in him would be broken. But one of the soldiers did pierce the side of his spear, or the side of him with a spear. And blood and water flowed out immediately. Now this happened also to fulfill prophecy, because it said that they will look on the one that had been pierced. Well, Joseph of Arimathea, a highly regarded member of the Jewish council, who was looking forward to the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Pilate was surprised because Jesus was already dead. And he called to the centurions and he said, has he been dead for some time? When Pilate was informed by the centurion that he actually had been dead for some time, he gave Jesus' body to Joseph. Now, Nicodemus was also with Joseph. And do you remember Nicodemus? He was the one that came to Jesus at night. And he took a mixture of myrrh and aloes weighing about 75 pounds. And they took Jesus's body and wrapped it with those herbs and the aloe and strips of linen according to the Jewish burial customs. Now, at the place where Jesus was crucified, there was a garden. And in the garden was a new tomb where no one was yet buried. It was actually the tomb of Joseph. And so they took Jesus there and put him inside. And they knew that the day that Sabbath was coming, and so that they were going to have to put him in there and close the tomb, and then Mary and all of the other ladies that had been following Jesus would come back later and do the rest of the burial. So Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, they saw where the body was placed, and the woman who had come accompanied Jesus from Galilee followed and saw the tomb as well and how his body was laid in it. And so they returned home before the end of the day and prepared spices and perfumes. And then on the Sabbath day, they rested because that was the command of that time. So they didn't do any preparing then. They did it all the night before. Well, the chief priests, you know, they've had it out for Jesus for a long time. So their minds are still working. And they knew that they needed to go back to Pilate and say, remember, Pilate, do you remember that while this deceiver was still alive, he said after 3 days that he was going to rise again. And that cannot happen because that will be worse than the first deception. Like that will make everything so horrible. And we know that he's not going to rise from the dead, but we think that his followers will go in there and steal his body and make it look like he rose from the dead. So we would like you to steal that tomb, and we want you to put soldiers all around it so that nobody can steal that body. So Pilate agreed, and he sent orders to have them seal the tomb. And he said that they should take all of the soldiers, or all the soldiers that they needed to keep it safe. So they took the soldiers and they went to the tomb and they sealed the stone. And that actually is the end of our story today. You'll have to tune in next week to see what happens next, which is the most exciting part of all. So it has been so fun to be here with you. I know I'm not Miss Lori. I look all different. But I hope that you all are having a great weekend. And it's just so nice to see you all. And I have some comments here, so we'll go through those real quick. Oh yes, Sophia, it is so sad for Jesus. So sad. The saddest part is that he had to be away from God. That is the saddest part. But, you know, the redemptive part of it is that because Jesus did this, we get to spend eternity in heaven with him. All right, well, you guys have a great day, and it was so nice to see you all. Take care, and I will see you all soon. Hopefully July 5th will be here before we know it. And then we can spend time together in our classroom. So thank you all and have a great day.